And what that means is that you have elected criminals to public office, because they are making decisions that at this point they have no excuse not to know. They reasonably should know is resulting in fraud, and they're doing it for self-serving political reasons. I hope that's not the case, but if it's the case, boy oh boy, some people need to go to jail. And not just the defendants in these cases. The people, if people are knowingly making public policy decisions and implementing public policy in a way that they reasonably ought to know is going to result in fraud, they should be arrested, convicted, and go to jail. And if we find that that's what's happening, and I have anything to say about it, you damn well better believe people's professional lives are going to end. It is going to be the end of the world for grifters, if I have anything to say about it. All right, we're going to talk about a couple of things today that may not immediately seem as though they're related to one another, but they are. And the way in which they're related is extraordinarily important. It's crucial for you to take the time to understand, so I appreciate you being with me here today. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the news that broke recently regarding the Office of Legislative Auditor here in Minnesota breaking a report that highlights the inadequacy of oversight of Feeding Our Future. For those of you who are in Minnesota and might not be familiar with this story, during COVID, there was a lot of federal dollars that were being rained down upon the states. And one of the mechanisms for that here in Minnesota was this program called Feeding Our Future. Cutesy name, isn't it? It was ostensibly put together in order to provide kids who, as we recall, were kept out of school during COVID with the opportunity to get the meals that they would normally have from being in school, lunch, right? And so the idea was that the federal government is going to rain all this money on the state, and then the state, in turn, is going to hand it over to these nonprofits, and these nonprofits, in turn, are going to somehow feed the kids. And that's just all going to go smooth, right? Like the administrative chunks being taken out of all those dollars all along the way, we're not worried about that. And then the actual implementation of how the actual food gets into the actual mouths of children, we're not going to worry too much about the details of that. And what resulted was exactly what you would expect. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fraud. And we've seen those stories. I mean, you had people buying luxury homes, luxury cars, taking massive vacations, funneling money out of the country to places that are potentially very dubious in terms of what they were ultimately doing with those taxpayer dollars that came out of your pocket. And there's just been very little accountability for this. Now, there have been arrests, there have been indictments, there have been cases, there have been convictions and plea deals, as I understand it, for like the actual people responsible for the fraud on the ground. But in terms of the people whose decisions, the public policy makers and the administrators and the bureaucrats who were implementing all of this and enabling it, there's been zero accountability on that front. None whatsoever. And so now we get this report, and this is just a small snippet of it here that was posted on X. In our review, we identified numerous instances where MDE, which is the Minnesota Department of Education, did not provide adequate oversight, especially given information it either had in its possession or should have obtained but did not. These instances span all of MDE's key oversight mechanisms, including its review of Feeding Our Future's annual sponsor applications, investigations of complaints involving Feeding Our Future, and oversight of an administrative serious deficiency process initiated due to deficiencies in Feeding Our Future's operations. Further, these instances span the nearly 4 years from 2018 to 2022, so before and throughout the pandemic years, all right, 2018 to 2022, during which Feeding Our Future received public funds to administer nutrition programs. MDE officials told us that the department began to have concerns about feeding our future only after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we think MDE failed to act on warning signs known to the department prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and prior to the start of the alleged fraud. As we describe in Chapter 2, Feeding Our Future was an outlier in terms of its large size in the years preceding the pandemic. At the same time, Feeding Our Future's annual applications, which we discuss in Chapter 3, reflected an organization that did not appear to have the staffing or procedures needed to manage the millions of dollars that pass through the organization annually. So, look, this is not the first time that the Office for Legislative Auditor has told us elected officials, us lawmakers, that we're making really bad decisions. They've made that very explicit to the Democrat trifecta multiple times in the 2 short years that I've been there. They just don't care, and they don't listen. They continue to, over the course of these past 2 years, they've continued to expand and double and triple and quadruple down upon the amount of money that they're funneling to nonprofits in this way, with the same complete lack of accountability and measures, procedures, staffing to be able to ensure any sort of honest dealing with these nonprofits. And the question really is why? And, you have to kind of speculate. When you get into intentions, when you get into motives, inherently you have to speculate. And my sense very much is that, and this is the most generous interpretation that I can offer, is that on the left and within the Democrat Party, the culture is such that intentions supersede outcomes. In all cases, intentions supersede outcomes. So if your intention was to feed kids, if your intention was to house the homeless, if your intention was to provide subsidy for the poor, if your intention was to provide meaningful health care to folks who are in need, if your intention was to teach students, to educate kids, then the actual outcomes on any of those fronts don't really matter at all. It's what were we trying to do? How do we feel about what our purpose is here? That's the driving force that is really at the center of public policy. And if I wanted to get deeply cynical about it, I could suggest that that's all political, right? It's what kind of a narrative can we construct in order to make ourselves look good, look at what we're trying to do, pay no attention to what's actually happening, right? But I hope it's not that. I really do. I hope it's not that. I hope it's not such a cynical, self-serving political motive. Because if it is, let's be clear about what it means if it is. If it is a cynical, self-serving political motive that's driving these things, then what that means is that you have elected criminals to public office. Because they are making decisions that at this point they have no excuse not to know. They reasonably should know is resulting in fraud, and they're doing it for self-serving political reasons. I hope that's not the case, but if it's the case, boy oh boy, some people need to go to jail. And not just the defendants in these cases. If people are knowingly making public policy decisions and implementing public policy in a way that they reasonably ought to know is going to result in fraud, they should be arrested, convicted, and go to jail. And if we find that that's what's happening, and I have anything to say about it, you damn well better believe people's professional lives are going to end. It is going to be the end of the world for grifters, if I have anything to say about it. Okay, there's this piece over at Alpha News. It's a commentary by a gal named Lori Jennings regarding vaccine injury and a shift in mentality that's happening behind the scenes, according to Lori, in legislators' willingness to acknowledge the reality of vaccine injuries. I want to go over this with you, and there's a particular point that she makes towards the end that I really want to kind of draw out and focus on and ask a couple of questions about, and then I'll try to tie it back to the Feeding Our Future thing because I think the two are related. So she writes, COVID has profoundly changed our lives. In my case, it got me out of my comfort zone and into the political arena. After my mom's COVID vaccine reaction, I became a COVID vaccine injury advocate. I have been fortunate to be in a group that comes together exclusively around COVID vaccine reactions. We are politically red and blue. We come together purple and surround those impacted in love. We are Team Humanity. As Team Humanity's legislative liaison, I've worked diligently over the past 3 years to get lawmakers' attention on the disconnect between public health policy and actual health outcomes. In my home state of Minnesota, we recently learned that our former public health commissioner developed blood clots and filed a vaccine reaction report, known as a VAERS report, a few months before she supported mandating state employees, healthcare workers, and college students. Throughout the pandemic, citizens were told one thing but observed another. Americans seeking accurate information have been subject to censorship, and our many legislators have refused to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth of vaccine injuries. Lately, however, I've observed a shift among lawmakers that gives me cause for cautious optimism that things could begin to move in the right direction. When I first started my work, I made the mistake of thinking lawmakers had a lack of data and barraged them with good quality studies. To my surprise, they weren't interested. They made it clear that they relied solely on the Minnesota State Department of Health, which in turn parroted the CDC. The few lawmakers who would meet showed little curiosity about any study that ran counter to the public health narrative. Worse, the CDC labeled my information misinformation, further hampering my efforts. So I want to pause here to just point out that this is absolutely correct. I can confirm from the inside of the process that this is how it works. And so many people, we had a recent gathering of candidates, Republican candidates for the Minnesota House to talk about campaigning. And I spoke with a number of them, and I've only been in for 2 years. I'm by no means a grizzled veteran, but in comparison to folks who are just starting on the path, I certainly have a little bit more insight than they do. And I had to laugh a little bit because they're so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and eager to get involved and to get into the legislature and to do good work. But I had to temper their expectations, because if you think you're going to come down to St. Paul, as this this lady did, with a good argument and data and facts and like a case, a rational case as to why you're right and the other side is wrong, and that is going to have any impact whatsoever on legislation, I hate to break it to you, but you got another thing coming. That's not how this process works. This process is not based upon reason and facts and logic and arguments and substance. None of that has any impact whatsoever on outcomes. I think that's pretty obvious based upon what we saw coming out of the Democrat trifecta the past 2 years. And it has been extraordinarily frustrating from my perspective as a first-term member to come in with what I hold to be those good arguments, right? And sometimes it's not even argument in the traditional sense. It's appeal to emotion, because I know that that's what they're most vulnerable to. Trying to make my case on an emotional level as to why what they're doing is going to bring harm to the things and people that they claim to value. And that doesn't even have any impact upon how they actually vote or what they actually put into their bills. And so, this is and that's not to say that you shouldn't come with your studies and your arguments and your facts. Of course you should. Of course we should be making the case, regardless of whether it persuades those who are currently in power. Because the people in power, the people who you're having these meetings with, that's one audience. The real audience, ultimately, for this material that you're bringing to the public, and they know this, which is why they classify it as misinformation and try to bury it or discredit it. The real audience for it is the voter, ultimately, because it's the voter who gets to decide who you're having these meetings with. And that's what's ultimately important. Let's continue back here. Lori goes on to write, I switched tactics and decided to appeal to the humanitarian side of the leader. See? Got to appeal to their emotions. I shared stories from the Team Humanity Substack, which publishes high quality personal accounts of harms and lives shattered by COVID vaccines. Suffering Minnesotans, newsmen, healthcare workers, children, college students, and politicians, among others. Conservative media had started to report on the rare side effects and injuries, and as a result, lawmakers on Team Red were willing to meet. In contrast, most lawmakers across the aisle remained unaware and would meet only if I had demonstrably injured constituent in their district, and even then, most begrudgingly. Following advice from a prominent Minnesota senator and doctor, I started to request meetings with an offer of resources the lawmaker could provide their constituents. Our meager offerings consisted of a support group and a handful of doctors willing to acknowledge and diagnose a myriad of complex reactions. Lawmakers were interested, and I started to get more meetings. In the last 2 months, there's been a noticeable sea change. I've secured meetings with nearly 60 lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Contrast this with the 24 meetings I was able to get in the 2 prior years. The most notable is the new willingness of blue lawmakers to meet. They are now ready to listen, and they are mostly receptive and compassionate. My ask is simple: acknowledge that the injured exist. Last week, while meeting with a blue lawmaker, I shared the story of an injured constituent who was a 37-year-old nurse and a personal fitness trainer. Following her shot, she developed a heart arrhythmia. She was dismissed and gaslit by her doctors, who insisted she was suffering from anxiety. I noticed the lawmaker had started to shake his head no. I paused and could not have been more surprised when he told me that he had new onset vertigo and tinnitus from his shot that worsened with each subsequent shot. He has struggled to be acknowledged. I was able to share my meager resources with him and provide, I hope, some support and consolation. I told him I have had several other blue lawmakers confirm vaccine reactions in their inner circle. He candidly said, this is the part, this is it, this is the punchline of this process here. He candidly said that behind closed doors, they are all talking about it. They all know. They won't go public because they don't know how to message it. Let's review that again. We're talking about vaccine injuries. We're talking about Democrat lawmakers. This is a Democrat lawmaker who she had a meeting with, and he candidly said that behind closed doors, they are all talking about it. They all know. They won't go public because they don't know how to message it. This is a burden that I do not carry. I don't carry the burden of how to message things. And I know sometimes that frustrates a few of my colleagues who are very concerned about messaging. But my messaging strategy is pretty simple. Tell the truth unapologetically. And when you get pushback, tell it again harder. That's my messaging strategy. And it has the benefit, one of the benefits, I mean, there's pros and cons to telling the truth. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be Pollyannish. But one of the pros is that you never run into this problem. You never run into the problem of how do I say something that I know to be true in a way that's on message. That's a problem you never have to worry about. That's a burden you never have to carry if you're committed to simply telling the truth for its own sake. And what I would suggest, taking this story at face value and knowing that there are some amongst my Democrat colleagues in the legislature who clearly see what is happening in the vaccine injury space and can no doubt discern the implications for that when it comes to public health policy, what I would suggest to you, and this is taking the partisan hats off. This is taking off the team jerseys. Just like person to person, human being to human being. and I would give this same advice to anybody, Republican or Democrat or independent or whatever the case may be. Just tell the truth. Just say what you know to be true and let everyone else worry about how to message it. If there are people out there who operate under the burden of having to figure out how to message true things, let them carry that burden. You don't have to carry that burden for them. And what I think you will find, this is what I predict, and I'll aim this specifically at my Democrat colleagues because I suspect that they, more than anyone, feel this burden most aggressively. I think what you'll find, if you are the first person to step forward and just say what you know to be true, with your own, like, not in a, and it doesn't even have to be like you come out swinging. It could be a whisper. It could be a casual mention. It could be something offered with compassion and reflection and a moment of growth. I've had this experience. It's taught me something I didn't know before. Here's what I now know to be true. And it's important that we take this into account as we move forward with public policy. Something as simple as that. If you're the first person to do that, there will be a second. And there will be a third. And before you know it, you're going to be having a real conversation. And the folks who are aligned on the side of denying reality are going to find themselves pretty isolated pretty quickly. And I think you'll find that even leadership will find themselves turning around and singing a new tune if you're willing to do that. Because they'll have to. They'll have to take the side of what's real, what's apparent, what's true. It raises too many, when you start having disagreement within the ranks regarding what's true and what's false, it catalyzes a process that burns away the untruth and reveals the truth. And so be a leader. We used to have those in both parties. We used to have leaders, people who were willing to say true things without apology and drag their friends kicking and screaming to that truth. And the same goes with feeding our future. I said I was going to connect these two things. I know. I'll amend that. I suppose I can't say I know. I highly suspect, based upon my interactions with my Democrat colleagues, that they know this is a huge problem. The misallocation of funds, the lack of accountability that has led to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fraud. I know the one thing I can say they know, because the Office of Legislative Auditor has told them, is that granting dollars to named organizations, like actually putting in statute, we're going to give X thousands of dollars to Fun Times Rainbow Happy Sunshine Group, that is a bad practice, because when it's in law that you're going to give this money to this entity, then you're going to give this money to this entity. There's no accountability, because the law says you're going to give them the money. And yet they've continued to bring and pass, and Governor Walz has continued to sign into law legislation that does precisely that. That says we're going to give X number of dollars to X group. It's unbelievable. They keep doing it. And so, again, this is another scenario where there's an opportunity for some Democrat somewhere to be a leader and to step from the herd and to say, you guys, enough is enough. Look at these OLA reports. Look at what we're being told. At some point, we have to take responsibility for this. And is there going to be political blowback for doing that? Of course there is. Of course there is. But think of it this way, like, this isn't even actually good advice for me to be giving a Democrat. Like, the worst thing that could happen from a purely partisan perspective, okay, from a 100% I only care about Republicans winning perspective, it's a bad idea for me to suggest to Democrats that they ought to do this. because it's their solidarity around the lie. It's their solidarity around the fraud that gives Republicans our highest advantage. Because right now, we can say Democrats are on the morally reprehensible side of this issue, of both of these issues: vaccine injury, feeding our future. They are unified around lies. They are unified around fraud. I can truthfully say that right now. The moment a Democrat, an elected Democrat, steps forward and leads on these issues and leads with the truth, that narrative falls apart. And now it's bipartisan. And now we're forced to have a conversation not about which party should be in charge, but about what type of person ought to be in charge. And I think that's a healthier conversation to have, actually.